John Graham, it's so good to see you. A scholar of Native American traditions, especially the Crow tribe in Montana and the Salish peoples up in Columbia River in Northwest America. You've also studied indigenous peoples around the world and been in many parts of the world where tribal traditions are still living. Can you help us to understand what that means, the livingness of these traditions, and maybe what is a cosmovision? What does that mean?
It's very good to start with the question or the observation of the living character of these traditions in the face of so many pressures over the last few decades especially. And without going on into issues of indigeneity, but to sound the question of sovereignty and to bring that question of the living voice of indigenous peoples to an understanding that the native peoples in close relationship with ecosystems and bioregion, that oftentimes that voice of native peoples, local peoples, is often the voice of local biodiversity also. And this is becoming more clearly understood in the ecological community, the conservation biology community, namely a sense that when local peoples are involved in the issue of conservation of local species, the whole project is much more successful. And I just want to draw out that conservation of species and conservation of peoples, cultural diversity, and biodiversity of animals and plants. How interesting that they go so closely together. So the living character of tradition and the sovereignty issue is very important in these discussions of indigenous traditions and ecology.
And how does that relate to cosmovision?
Yeah, thank you. This term is widely used now in gatherings of indigenous people. I think that the term actually comes out of archaeoastronomy, an observation in that particular discipline that understood specific places among indigenous people that were very carefully aligned to astronomical observations, so that seasonal transitions in the year, the solstice and so forth, connected to migration of animals, and especially agricultural seasons, that there was a sense of the placement of buildings so that star, sun, moon were aligned, and certainly some of the pueblos in the southwest show these characteristics. So cosmovision coming out of a particular discipline, but an English term that begins to identify very quickly and carefully a sense that many small-scale societies, indigenous people, have a larger understanding of themselves as individuals and as a community, of participating in much larger forces in the cosmos, and that the living character of these forces is that which a individual or a community can align themselves with these forces and foster the life of themselves as a people, and often, quite often, of the local biodiversity. That the land itself could be brought alive through ritual, renewed through ritual.
So Thomas Berry used to say native peoples live in a universe, or you've often said these are living cosmologies. Can you spell that out a little bit more?
Yes, that's a lovely phrase, isn't it, from Thomas Berry, that sense of living in a universe rather than in systems. So he would distinguish the artifice of systems that mark us as contemporary individuals, whether it's our banking system or our national system. But when he would say indigenous people live in a universe, he meant that proximity to the natural world, that closeness to the natural world. Say, for example, in the northwest of the Amazon in Colombia, an understanding among Desana people, Barsana peoples who are in the headwaters of the Valpes region, where these rapids and waterfalls have actually held out many adventurers or colonial presence, and these people have maintained their integrity up into the present, and certainly are now contacted by anthropologists, missionaries, and so forth. But these peoples in this region have a very exquisite understanding of themselves as living in a riverine universe. So I mention that because it provides such an interesting and striking parallel, say perhaps to Puebloan people, where the settlement of Pueblo is made in a cosmic dimension. So you have between indigenous peoples very different understandings of cosmovision. It's not simply a flat, uniform understanding among these many diverse indigenous peoples.
And in that cosmovision, what does traditional environmental knowledge mean, teak?
So again, among the Desana or Barasana people, they speak very clearly about the relationship of these mythic rivers that were anacondas that brought the ancestors, and the forests. And the universe is seen as ultimately deriving from the sun, that the anacondas come from that source, and that they carry with them the energies of the sun. But the rivers are subject to degradation. And I mean by that the natural cycling of forces rather than destructive industrial degradation. So that these native peoples understand the relationship between forest, animal and plant diversity, especially the forest, animals in the forest, as being able to impart energies into the river and consequently life in the river. So this cosmovision is a cycling of forces that's very significant in terms of the understanding the ritual life of these particular people. So also we could speak of the Crow people and their understanding of their relationship to their homeland and the biodiversity in their homeland as a sense of power. They use the term, women say mashpe and men say bashpe. Slight difference there, but it's indicative of a gendered understanding of their language and of the landscape even. And that men and women enter into ritual activity in different ways in order to both renew themselves and to renew the landscape.
So you've got a cosmovision, you've got a deep sense of place, and you've got rituals that weave these tribal peoples into place and into their community life. Can you give something that helps us to really appreciate this ritual life?
One broad example that's interesting is to consider a healer. Often the term shaman is used nowadays, and that term comes out of the Tungus people in Siberia, and it's now been used to try and identify a unique presence in the human family, but still active among many indigenous people, namely the capacity of a healer to connect, reconnect, to help an individual realign themselves. So in the Navajo context, this shamanistic dimension from their old hunter-gatherer tradition, transmitted into the agricultural and much more settled cosmovision of the Pueblo people, and the chanting tradition emerged. So that the chanter, while generally a male and sometimes a female, but a chanter would not themselves be the healer, but the chant is shamanistic, has shamanistic healing dimension. It's possible to reconnect a person with the sacred places in the landscape and the energies of the mythic heroes by bringing them into the sand painting. So it's an interesting way in which a shamanistic ceremonial is transmitted by people, whereas in the northern plains you find actual healers who are themselves reconnecting with the forces in the Crow context, with the Bashpe, with the powers in the landscape, and especially with animals. I think sometimes how very old that must be in the human family. Because what happened when our symbolic consciousness became reflexive in the mode that we separated out of the landscape that we lived in? Because many people who are not native have a sense of native people as living seamlessly in the landscape. But we know also that native people see themselves as yearning for that connection again, and restoring it through ritual, so that they're also, there's a sense of the disconnect, and shamanism is a very old reconnection.
Yes, and the whole totemic idea of having feathers or furs and so on that are special, or a medicine bundle that makes
Yes.
those connections.
And given through intuitive moments when a person understands those powers in the world, giving to individuals often, as well as the individuals in the community context, because it's not possible to talk about indigenous traditions without emphasizing the communal. So that when these kinds of medicines, to use that term, or objects that are considered to have power, when they're given to an individual, their very use and their whole purpose is a communal restoration. It's brought back to the people in healing modes.
We have a lot to learn about Native peoples all over the world, and
Yes.
thank you for your study.
And isn't it good that we still have so many elders among indigenous people to help guide us where they want, into language preservation and into their traditions?
Indeed. Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you ever so much.